Hello Year 10 and welcome to your English lesson today. My name is Miss Lakegrange and today we're going to be focusing on your Edexcel conflict anthology. This is all revision. You covered these poems at the end of Year 9 and you will have covered them at different times in Year 10 as well. But there are 15 to cover, so it's important that we come back to them at regular points during your GCSE curriculum to make sure that you hold on to that knowledge and you also continue to practice the skill of analysing poetry. There is also an unseen poetry question on your exam, which is another reason to make sure that we keep these skills fresh. So today, as you can see on the screen, if you've got it, it would be great if you could have your poetry anthology, but if you don't worry. You will need pen and paper, and don't forget at the end to do your quiz. Okay, let's get started. As this is revision, I just wanted to show you a way that you could lay out your notes for today. You don't have to do this, but this is something that I find quite useful. So on your sheet of paper, you could write the title of the poem in the middle of the page. Today we're focusing on Belfast Confetti, so that would go in the middle. You could then split your page into four because we're going to focus on four key areas today. So we're going to focus on what the poem is actually about, just a bit of revision on the basics. We're then going to zoom in on language choices made by Kieran Carson. We're then going to zoom in on form and structural choices that he made. And we are also going to make sure we've got a good grasp of context. So the social and political historical context of the poem, as well as the writer's life. Before we dive in, I just want to remind you of the toolbox of vocabulary that you need when you're learning about and writing about poetry and speaking about poetry. So first of all, we need to be able to differentiate between the poet and the speaker. So the poet is obviously the person who wrote the poem. The speaker is the voice in the poem, and that is not necessarily the voice of the poet, even if that voice is probably quite similar to the poet's voice. We refer to them as the speaker, as it's a piece of fiction. In our prose writing, so when we're writing story, we use sentences and paragraphs. When we are writing a poem or when we're talking about a poem, we refer to those kind of paragraphs as stanzas, and we refer to the line of the poem, so rather than a sentence. Poetry often has rhyme and meter, so it's written in verse. Or it could be written in free verse, so it's free of rhyme and meter. And then finally, a technique that is unique to poetry is the use of caesura and enjambment. So caesura, think about the C section, is where a line is cut by a piece of punctuation, whereas enjambment is when the line of poetry does not have punctuation at the end of it and it runs over onto the other line. Okay, if you're uncertain about any of those still, please pause the video, go to Google, where you'll also get a clear explanation. We're going to make a start with context. So I'd like to invite you to pause the video now to make some notes based on your memory, on the poet Kieran Carson, what you know about Northern Ireland, and what you know about the Troubles. Okay, let's go through the answers together. So, Kieran Carson, who is the poet, there he is. He was born in Belfast, which is the capital city of Northern Ireland, in 1948, and he wrote this poem in 1990. So this was when the Troubles were very much still, that conflict was still happening. He was raised Catholic, although he wasn't a practicing Catholic. And he was from one of the only 5 families in Belfast who communicated predominantly in Irish. That was his first language growing up, and English was his second language. He's from Northern Ireland, as we know, as Belfast is the capital city of Northern Ireland. And Northern Ireland, if you look at the picture, it can perhaps help you to understand why there was conflict there. So as you can see, Northern Ireland is part of Great Britain. And the rest of Ireland, the Republic of Ireland, just below, is its own country. So there are people in Northern Ireland who are happy to be unified with Great Britain, part of the Union Jack. They are the Unionists. But there are also people in Northern Ireland who are not happy with that, or were not happy with that, and are therefore nationalists. They want to be one nation as Ireland. And religion comes into play because Unionists were predominantly Protestants and nationalists were predominantly Catholic. Okay, I've put in the peace wall because I think this can sort of help you to understand that feeling that existed in Belfast. So you had this wall that is still there, that's built through the city, and it was to separate the Protestants and Catholics. And it really helps you to sort of see the conflict and to understand the division that existed and still exists today between those two groups of people. Finally, we're going to look at we're going to make notes on the Troubles. So the Troubles is the name that's been given to that 30-year conflict that was taking place in Northern Ireland between the Unionists and the Nationalists. Of course, there was conflict between those two sides, but we also had that the added conflict between British soldiers who were put in place to hold law and order, and then the protesters. Often missiles were thrown, scrap metal was used, but there was also bombs and explosives that were used. So again, imagining what it was like to grow up and live in a city where this was your sort of daily norm, to see soldiers on the streets and to be aware that missiles could be thrown at any time. We're going to cover the basics of the poem. So what is the poem about? And again, I invite you to pause the video, just write down actually what are the events that take place in this poem. Okay, let's see what you got. So hopefully you've written down that the speaker is explaining that the riot police have just arrived and then a bomb goes off in Belfast. This blast from the bomb is then described in a very figurative way. Figurative is just a word that we use when we're speaking about similes, metaphors, personification. So it's the word that groups all of those technical words together. And this figurative description explains how all the attempts to escape this conflict fail because every path is blocked. And then the poem ends in a state of panic and confusion. The speaker is really struggling to make sense of this situation. And you might think back to when we were talking in the context about what it would feel like to grow up and live in a place where conflict is the norm. It would create an incredible amount of confusion and panic in a person. Now let's delve into the poem itself. So I'm going to start by focusing on language, and I always start with the title. We can get so much from the title of a poem. So I'd like you to write down, you should have already written down the title, and then just to ask yourself these 3 questions. So what do you know about each word in the title? What are the connotations of each word? And what image is created by putting these words together? Try to make sure you don't run out of space because you're going to do a lot more work in that language box. So if you need to do this on a separate page, that is fine. Pause the video and then we'll come back together to see what we've got. Okay, so this is my response. So the word Belfast, I know it's the capital city of Northern Ireland. I know it's a place where a lot of the conflict during the Troubles took place, and I know that it's also the city that the poet is from. The word confetti, that refers to small bits of colourful paper that is thrown at weddings. So the connotations of these words, it's strange because I've got this mixture of violence and conflict, and that's strangely mixed with celebration because we throw confetti at weddings. So this is quite jarring and quite unexpected. The image that's created in my mind when I put these 2 words together is one of chaos, as I'm imagining objects flung into the air, kind of like confetti, but these objects cause pain and destruction rather than kind of bringing joy and creating a beautiful image as we might expect. So I guess it kind of shows it's like what he feels has happened to his city, one that perhaps he'd like to be able to celebrate, but instead it's always marred by this violence and conflict. It's important at this moment that we now reread the poem. Poetry is meant to be listened to and read aloud, so you might pause and read it to yourself, or you can listen to me reading, it's up to you. So, Belfast, Confetti by Kieran Carson. Suddenly, as the riot squad moved in, it was raining exclamation marks. Nuts, bolts, nails, car keys, a fount of broken type. And the explosion itself, an asterisk on the map. This hyphenated line, a burst of rapid fire. I was trying to complete a sentence in my head, but it kept stuttering. All the alleyways and side streets blocked with stops and colons. I know this labyrinth so well. Balaclava, Raglan, Inkerman, Odessa Street. Why can't I escape? Every move is punctuated. Crimea Street, dead end again. A Saracen, Kremlin 2 mesh, mackerel on face shields, walkie-talkie. What is my name? Where am I coming from? Where am I going? A fusillade of question marks. We're going to continue with our notes on language, and we're going to break that down into 3 sections today. So after I've finished going through this, you're going to pause the video and you're going to make your own notes. So start off by finding the language in the poem about destruction. So focusing on the violent verbs that you notice. Once you've found those, perhaps group them together and look at them and think about the impression that's created. Second, you're going to go and find the language that is about punctuation. So it's dotted around in the poem. Again, group it all together, look at where it is, and start to think about, again, the impression created. A bit of help here. What do we normally use punctuation to do? What do we normally associate punctuation with? And then how is that meaning subverted in this poem? That's a bit of a challenge. And then finally, I'd like you to look for the language that creates chaos, so chaotic language. And to do that, have a look at all the unanswered questions. Again, group them together and consider the impression that is created by these. Let's start then with that destructive language. So you might have zoomed in on the verbs burst, stuttering, trying, blocked. If we look at them together, it creates this image of fragmentation, so things breaking apart, an impression that everything around the speaker is being destroyed and broken. The use of punctuation is really interesting in this poem. So think about what we usually use punctuation for. It creates structure to our writing. But by scattering punctuation words throughout the poem, Carson creates this impression of a loss of control. And he also uses punctuation to describe weapons. So instead of saying bullets, he says hyphenated line. This creates an impression of terror, again, instead of the order that we'd expect to come from this language. And then finally, we're going to focus on the chaotic language. And I asked you to think about those unanswered questions. They emphasize the speaker's confusion. He also lists lots of objects, and this makes him seem overwhelmed, as though he's surrounded by noise and chaos. We're moving on to our final box on our revision page, and this is focusing on the poet's use of structure and form. So I'm going to ask you 3 questions that I'd like you to respond to, and then we'll go through the feedback together. So to start off with, the poet uses lots of irregular line lengths, incomplete sentences, caesura and enjambment. Note those down and then write down the impression that you think is created by these techniques together. Secondly, the poem starts in media res, which is the technical term for starting in action. So starts with suddenly. What is the impact of this? And then finally, you might have noticed that the first stanza is all in past tense, whereas the second stanza is all in present tense. What impression does this shift in tense create? So we'll go through the suggested answers together. So for that first one where you were looking at the impact of the irregular line lengths, the incomplete sentences, the caesura and enjambment, you could say that they give the poem a fragmented feel and they reflect how the speaker is struggling to think clearly. The lines appear broken, and that could perhaps mimic how the speaker repeatedly reaches dead ends as they attempt to flee violence. The impact of starting in media res, so in the action, this imitates the speaker's confused memories of the event. It also creates the image of the speaker being flung into a situation that they were not prepared for. And finally, the impact of shifting from the past tense to the present tense. This shift creates a sense of immediacy and shows the confusion is still ongoing. The speaker is struggling to come to terms with what they've seen and how they feel. And it gives the impression that there's no resolution. Remember, he wrote this in 1990 and the Troubles didn't end until 1998. So there is no end to this, it is present. To finish off today's lesson, I'm going to give you 3 poems that you could link to Belfast Confetti based on a theme. And just before I do that, I'm going to very briefly recap why we're doing that. This is the exam specification for Edexcel. So this explains what is going to be on each of your papers. And if you look here, section B, poetry since 1789. For part 1, you'll be asked to answer one question on one named poem from your anthology, reproduced in the question paper, and one poem of choice. And you will compare those poems, focusing on language, form, and structure, as well as context. So to help you plan for that, we're now going to look at 3 poems that you could use as comparison. So your final activity is just to think about the comparisons that you can make between Belfast Confetti and other poems in the anthology. So I've selected 3 themes that I can see are evident in the poem Belfast Confetti, and I've had to think about other poems in the anthology that share those themes. So firstly, conflict in wartime. We know that it was written in 1990 and the Troubles did not end until 1998, so it's really focused on that time in war. And you could link that perhaps to the poem The Man He Killed. Secondly, a second theme is the reality of conflict. So rather than being a sort of propaganda piece in positive reflection of conflict, looking at the negative impact. And you could link that perhaps to the poem Exposure by Wilfred Owen, which was written in response to the First World War experiences. And then finally, that theme of the feeling of fear is definitely present for the speaker in Belfast Confetti, and is also very present for the speaker in the poem Extract from the Prelude. And again, you could think about how to compare that fear. So I would invite some of you now to plan a comparison, and perhaps move that planning into a written response, comparing on one of those themes to one of those poems. If you do complete that work, please take a photo of it and send it in to englishteacher@carmanor.org.uk. We would love to see how you're getting on and be able to give you some feedback. But can everybody now please just head over to the last slide to give you the quizzes code so that you can complete the quiz on this lesson. To complete the quiz on quizzes, you'll need to enter the pin 5410677. It's just in the bottom left-hand side of the screen. Best efforts and good luck, and thank you for your time and effort today.